So let's take a look at one strong army list for each faction in Warhammer 40k, and what people are putting on the table after the big points and rules update. A big thank you to the Warhammer merch people Starforged for sponsoring this video, more about them a little bit later. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking army lists, and in this video I thought we'd go over one for each faction in the game, looking at one example of what one good player has done well with, what they've chosen to put on the table, and a few of the reasons that it's quite strong right now. For this one, I bear in mind that it's just going to be one thing that someone's done okay with, not necessarily the 100% certain best thing, or the only way to play that faction. Particularly at the moment, plenty of armies have at least a couple of different viable ways to play, even if some tend to stand out a bit more than the others. This is basically following the first major gaming weekend after 40k's latest balance update. It does mean that we're still a little bit light on the tournament data at the moment, but it did help that two of the events last weekend were really quite big, enormous super majors with over 200 players in them, so there's quite a lot of chance to show a lot of people doing well with armies. The lists here are mainly from best coast pairings. At first choice I tried to go with anything that's gone undefeated or just one loss in a 5-round event or more. And given that most of 40k is at least somewhat balanced at the moment, even in just one tournament weekend, it was fairly easy to find one example for the vast majority of factions with that. This will be for 27 armies in 40k, with the Emperor's Children not featuring as they've still not gotten tournament live yet until their actual codex release. But besides them, let's talk through one faction for each one in the game, starting with the Imperium and then going forward to Chaos and Xenos. First up for the Space Marines, we've got an Ultramarines example. This one was won by Sam Nash, who used it to take first at the Goonhammer Open, going 6 games undefeated in a 63-player tournament. Ultramarines didn't really feel like they lost all that much power despite some points nerfs, still with Guilliman on the table, with Double Oath a moment and lots of free stratagems. Maybe the way that the nerfs had fallen on certain units such as Uriel Ventress Centurions and 4 Ballistas and Vindicators meant that it seemed like Gladius was more of a winner versus say Ironstorm or Vanguard, and this one does seem to be a Gladius list that's done really well here, but it's also a Gladius list that's taking a whole load of units that went up in points a bit. Looks like this army would have been 70 points cheaper prior to the balance update. In any case, Gladius is the tried and tested balanced Space Marine detachment with a little bit of firepower, some reactive moves, advance and shoot, and advance and charge. As mentioned, Rabute Guilliman's here for his Double Oath a moment, lots of free stratagems for things nearby, and Marnius Calgar's here too with a unit of company heroes. Despite both squads going up 10 points, he still makes the cut, it would seem. More command point generation there, and a nice scary tanky unit to scrap in the midboard. There's a couple of lone characters, one combi lieutenant that could be used to hide Rabute Guilliman and trigger his special rules, and then interestingly enough also a lone Gravis captain as well, which certainly feels like he's been a feature in a few Gladius lists recently. A really tanky character with Artificer armor for the boosted save and the feel no pain. Then there's a unit of infiltrators for a +1 to hit, an invader ATV that can be a nice cheap trading unit, a unit of scouts to take the midboard, and then a whole load of Space Marine firepower, 3 Ballistas Dreadnoughts, 2 Vindicators and a Gladiator Reaper. As with Space Marine lists before, that's just an enormous amount of damage when boosted by Oath a moment, and really quite intimidating defensive profiles to chew through, with 2+ saves that you could use Armour of Contempt on. The Gladiator Reapers may be a little bit different, but against the right list with a bunch of 1 wound infantry, that'll really chew through those. Overall, certainly looks like a scary Ultramarines list, not really too surprised to see them still doing all very well for the Space Marines. It does feel pretty unlikely that other chapters will see much play compared with Ultramarines at the competitive level, while Guilliman is just this good for the points. Ultramarines also went 5 games undefeated last week as well. This was John Lennon's Ultramarine Stormlance list. Again, Calgar, Guilliman, some Assault Centurions and a Storm Raven interestingly enough. Lots of skirmish units and some Storm Speeder Hammer Strikes. Also looking like some very scary stuff there. Next up, we've got the Astra Militarum, who got some fairly big nerfs in the balance update, particularly to their Bridgehead Strike, having Scions and Scion command squads go up a bit, and that detachment getting nerfed in a couple of different ways. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it looks like basically everyone's pivoted to Hammer of the Emperor and Combined Regiment, both of which had a lot of good placings at the last weekend. And this list is a Combined Regiment example that took second at that same tournament by Nassim Fauchain, going 5 wins to 1 loss. The Combined Arms Regiment is the one that gives you lethal hits for your infantry against non-vehicles and monsters, and then gives you lethal hits for your tanks against everything that is a vehicle or monster, so nice easy damage buffs there, plus a few ways to get some extra orders and the reinforcement stratagem. The Scions certainly got nerfed hard, but there's still a unit of them in this list, 10 of them with a Tempestus command squad, so some fairly savage damage there with lethal hits on the special weapon drop. But then otherwise it did seem likely that the Guard would pivot more to tanks and Tauroxes with Kazakin in them, and there's certainly plenty here. A Rogel Dawn tank commander with the usual weapon choices and Grand Strategist for an extra order, and he's heading up a couple of Lehman Ross battle tanks, tanks, good general purpose damage with their rerolls, and they certainly like the lethal hits with their melter sponsons. There's also a Hellhound that can ignore cover for things as well. That's particularly nice with the battle tank shooting. There's 2 Tauroxes with Kazakin in. They take melters, plasmas, the mine and the sniper rifle. They can move fast and are just really efficient against most things with their self-order. Then for support things, there's a bunch of orders coming out of Ursula Creed, who looks like she's with Acadian Command Squad in Acadian Shock Troops unit. That'd throw 4 orders out to really quite a long way, and could give commands to the things that are moving forward. It looks like there's 2 sets of 20 Death Corps Kriegsmen to take the midboard, and I guess either them or the Kazakin could be a good choice for reinforcements. Potentially I guess Creed could use Fields of Fire between one of the squadron things and one of the infantry things for free. Finally, there's 2 sets of Kaschans. Looks like one of them in a Chimera with a pair of heavy flamers. Nice expendable infantry to fight for the midboard. Overall, that feels like really quite a cool looking and really nicely balanced guard list. Nice to have some tanks, some elites and some infantry all working together. I think it's quite fun to see some big squads of Death Corps back on the table as well. It looks like for guard the main choice is between the Combined Arms, Warhammer of the Emperor with a bunch of tank spam, and again Tauroxes with Kazakin in. For the Adeptus Custodes, it does seem that people have chosen to embrace the Lines of the Emperor as the detachment that they think that they've got the most chance to win with. More people took the new Custodes detachment compared with the rest combined, and they also got an event win with the Lines of the Emperor as well. This one by Ezra Blow, taking first at OTT 2025 GT, a slightly smaller one of 30 players. The Lines of the Emperor is the one that favours big individual units fighting far from each other, and that gives them a very dangerous +1 to wound, which is nasty on both the shooting and the melee, a really dangerous fighty relic called Amon Immortis, and a bunch of pretty powerful stratagems that are helpful enough to scrap for the midboard. In this one, despite their points increase, there's still 2 Blade Champions with 2 squads of 5 Wardens. They only went up 20 points in total per unit of them, and they were really efficient before. They still are now. Blade Champions are very dangerous and help get them where they need to be, and the Wardens are just a really tanky unit between the -1 to wound and the Feel No Pain. There's a squad of Custodian Guard with Kyria Draxus in them for a very scary shooting unit. Her firepower will be pretty brutal with the Lines of the Emperor buff. Then there's 5 Alorus Custodian Terminators, 1 unit of 3 and 1 unit of 2. They're all taking spears. It looks like one will probably go with that shield captain with Amon Immortis unless he's going solo or something. But that'd be a spectacularly punchy unit, and they can do interesting things like their teleport across the board, and potentially in this detachment split into multiple individual units if that makes sense too with the fun stratagem. Then there's 2 Caladius tanks that can provide some fire support from the back. They don't get special benefits, but at the same time they can support units without having to be close to them. And then 2 units of prosecutors that could be nice for some actions and objectives. Overall, does seem that there's a lot of enthusiasm for the Lines of the Emperor. I'm still maybe a little bit yet to be convinced as to whether or not it's significantly stronger than, say, Shield Host. Looks like the Lines one only had around about a 47% win rate on the first weekend, which isn't exactly standout. I guess we'll see how they do from here. Next up, we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus, who recently seem to have been having a bit of a tough time of it in the tournament stats, though they did have a fair few high placings this time. Perhaps the biggest and most impressive one was this Halo Screed Battleclade one by Samuel Martin, placing 4th at the South Coast Super Major, one of the 2 enormous Super Major style events of well over 200 players. This guy going 6-1 and the first 6 games undefeated, so easily the equivalent of winning a grand tournament elsewhere. The Halo Screed one is the Admech Grotmus one, where the Tech Priest can assert some direct command over a certain amount of units, then they get some boosted options for powerful stratagems, plus have some interesting enhancements as well. Looks like Belisarius Call has made the cut in this one. He is looking like really quite an efficient unit after the solid points cut that he had. Only 135 points I think makes him a seriously tempting pick now. He can potentially give some reroll ones to some scary firepower like the Scorpius tanks. There's 2 Tech Priest Manipuluses that go in the Cash from Breacher units, it would seem. They're very big scary damage dealer units, particularly in Halo Screed with the combos that they can have. One of them gets vastly boosted melee with inloaded lethality. I'd guess that he might go in the smaller unit perhaps. And the other one gets Sanctified Ordnance for some longer range weapons, which would be pretty nice for putting out that arc rifle fire to yet more areas of the board. That would help with rapid fire range a bit. Otherwise there's a Skitari Marshal for some big rerolls, for some Vanguard jumping out of a transport maybe. And a Techno-Archaeologist for some deep strike denial. Sometimes they're fielded solo, but I guess he could give some OC if he does join a unit in this one. Otherwise, for the rest of the squads, there's 1 unit of 10 Rangers and 2 units of 10 Vanguard. They can trigger the rerolls for the Cataphrone Breachers and provide a bunch of OC. Looks like some of them would go in one of the Dune Riders, and the other Dune Rider would have a bunch of Rust Stalkers in it with the Transonic Blades. Potentially they can be delivered to some long combats with aggressive impulse here, or the detachment rule could allow you to advance and charge. There's some Taraxi Skystalkers for jumping on and off the board and doing some secondary objectives, some Infiltrators to take the mid-board and skirmish with lighter infantry, the transports, and then as mentioned a pair of Scorpius Disintegrators with Ferromite cannons, some of the more efficient anti-tank choices, though the Cataphren Breaches are definitely chip in this detachment as well. Overall fairly scary stuff with a whole bunch of different threats and some good buffing options there. Really cool to see AdMech gets a good result like this. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, which is Starforged. They're basically makers of a whole bunch of Warhammer merch things, lots of trinkets and giftware type stuff, including various types of 40k themed jewellery, keyrings, fridge magnets and things like that. One thing they wanted to highlight a bit was this Blood Angels pin badge. Basically a fun medal style pin with a whole bunch of Blood Angels text on it, the chapter symbol and appropriate blood chalice. They've got a whole load more than that though. I'll put a few other things on the screen now. If you go on their site and search for any 140k army, a whole bunch of stuff comes up. They've got a whole ton of fridge magnets and things for their different chapters. I did find it kind of weird to see actual 40k jewellery being made when they first did these. There's a black Templar ring here. Then plus a whole load of other designs, things like the Grey Knights one, and I quite enjoyed the Astra Militarum one as well, with a sort of Lehman Russ treads laid into the back of it. Other 40k pieces and trinkets like these Purity Seals, again they've got a fair few of them themed to different chapters, or ones for the Mechanicus or the Sisters of Battle. Loads of different pin badges, again a bunch of Imperial factions, or one that you can dedicate yourself to the Four-Armed Emperor with the Genestealer Cults. Feels like the sort of thing that you'd use to spot other people on the insurrection. And for a couple of the things that I found maybe some of the most fun things that they had, they've got a bunch of pendants. I quite like the Power Claw one for that, plus the little Melter Bomb keyring. I don't know why they appeal to me, maybe just the fact that they're sort of like model parts that you might get in a miniature kit but made into fancy metal. In any case, feel free to check them out, there'll be links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one of course. Getting back to those 40k army lists though, and next up we have the Adepta Sororitas. They had a few small buffs in the balance updates, though I'd argue not exactly crazy ones. Seems that the first few people to put them on the table haven't done too badly since. The Hallowed Martyr's been the detachment of choice, much as it was before, and a couple of people managing some high placings with that one. By Tivi Piotsky, which I'm probably pronouncing very wrong, came fourth at Team Keelhaul GT. That was a singles event, and his list went 4-1 against a field of 40 players. It certainly felt like on paper the big drop to 10 Lady Sacrosanct squads was enough to make them into a really interesting unit, and it seems that at least holds up somewhat in practice, as there were no less than 30 Sacrosancts on the board, each led by a Hospitaller for a 5+ Feel No Pain and some Swab regeneration, perhaps now finally getting to the point where they're cheap enough that they're meaningfully annoying to kill for their points cost. I'd guess they probably make their way up the board in the Rhinos. Then on top of that there's just the one Immolator and a choice of things to transport there between Dominions and Battle Sisters. I guess good enough to split one squad in half for some extra utility units, though it is just quite a lot of sisters on the board full stop at a big 60 of them in the army list, and still having enough room for some leader characters with a Dialogus and the Palatine with the Through Suffering and Strength fighting enhancement, and also St. Celestine as well. I guess handy enough in a very character focused detachment. I guess that would put quite a lot of weight on mid-board objectives, and Hallowed Martyrs has the option to try and control some enemy combats, forcing them to attack one unit rather than another, and the potential for individual characters to annoyingly survive if you feed them a command point and some miracle dice. Then for a bit of holy firepower to back up the sisters advancing, there's 3 Castigator tanks, interestingly taking the autocannons rather than the battle cannons. I'm not 100% sure what the motivation is there. I feel like most people I've seen tend to take the battle cannons for the ignores cover. I guess the autocannons could be nice enough to punch up, maybe if they're buffed by other castigators and working together perhaps. In any case, nice to see the sisters get a result, and doing so with units that went down in cost like the Sacrosancts and the Dominions. Hopefully it'll be enough to at least maintain themselves somewhere within the mid-ranks of 40k as opposed to being flatly towards the bottom like before. For the Grey Knights, they're still very much playing with their Warpbane task force. It did get a small nerf in the balance update, with Purgation squads no longer being able to shoot round corners and still get the big rerolls, so perhaps unsurprisingly this Warpbane task force list that did well doesn't feature any of those. This one's by Kian Tan and came in 20th at the South Coast Super Major. Still 4 wins to just the 1 loss though at the massive great big event. The Warpbane task force is the one that gives you the big rerolls within the area of control, plus a few handy stratagems as well. This one goes very heavy on the Dread Knights with a lack of those Purgation squads I suppose. 2 Grandmaster ones that take silencers, and one with the Paragon of Sanctity enhancement that can give you some much needed rerolls once per game. There's a Tech Marine with Radiant Champion, who could support the Dread Knights a bit, and the enhancement also gives him unusually boosted melee power and precision. And then Brother Captain Stern, who's kind of fun to see. I'd guess he's just here as a lone disruptive model, going solo and then getting up when he dies with his special rule. I guess he'd have to be actually, given that he's a Terminator and there aren't any other Terminators in the list. Otherwise, to support the Dread Knights, maybe clear out a bit of infantry, there's 2 strike squads with their sticky objectives, 2 sets of the now slightly cheaper interceptors, they take an incinerator each, and some nice fast moving shooting and close combat, and then just the 1 set of purifiers, maybe going kind of light on them for this list where they can provide the rerolls within an aura. And finally a unit of servitors, I'd guess maybe running with the Tech Marine, though they could be going just completely solo. Overall, certainly a lot of scary damage though, with big Dread Knights with massive inbuilt rerolls. For another flavour of Knights, we've got the Imperial Knights. It feels like they're probably going to be towards the upper end of 40k again, being really quite a strong faction already, and not really seeing any nerfs but a couple of small buffs to the faction. For one example of a list that did well for them, there was this one by Phil Gilchrist, coming in 10th at the Rocky Mountain Open, the other great big super major tournaments, going 5 wins to just 1 loss. They bring all the might with their noble lance, with the 6+ feel no pain, the inbuilt rerolls, and big bonuses if you can slay a warlord. Canis Rex is in pride of place, as he often is, with his massive damage plus 3 stratagems. Unsurprisingly, there's mass armigers on the board, 4 Helverins and 4 Warglaves. If anything, this is one of the lists that runs fewer armigers compared with some. And then interestingly, to support them, there's a Knight Crusader with thermal cannon and Ironstorm missiles. Just a whole load of firepower and more if he can ever stay still. He has Mythic Hero to potentially put his Bondsman ability on 2 Helverins to make the 2 of them extra shooty. Overall, lots of raw power, lots of armigers to do actions and skirmish type things for objectives. Certainly looks intimidating to fight, like a lot of Knight armies at the moment. There was also this Noble Lance list from last week as well. This one going 5-0 undefeated to take down a grand tournament by Dustin Hammond. Maybe not so enormously different for this one. Just trade out the Crusader for a couple more Warglaves and then a couple of Assassins for some lone operative objective grabbing. For the Imperial Agents, they were one of the armies I struggled to find a recent example of, given that almost no one's running them at grand tournaments unless they want a challenge, but given that their faction got absolutely tiny updates to the point where it doesn't really matter too much, I thought we'd just go back to this one by Courtney Thompson, who used it to place first at Warzone Wellington, the biggest single win for the faction so far, going 5 games undefeated by Imperialis fleet. I guess this list would have got very slightly cheaper with the Collectus being fewer points. I guess that might not matter though if you want the opportunity to flex between the Assassins anyway, as they can do. In any case, for the Imperial Agents, the fleet one is the one that most tend to go for when they're trying to be competitive. A helpful rule to either really punish one unit by dealing extra damage to it, or making units particularly good at surviving on objectives. And then there's enhancements for things like infiltrating units and deep striking Voidfarers units, and a few movement support things for the stratagems to basically be an annoying board control army, eking out victories by scoring a bunch of points but not really killing the enemy so much. With that in mind, there's a whole load of fairly sturdy chaff. 3 big units of Subductors, which are really quite good defense for the points with those shields. They're going to take more damage to kill than the opponent would really like. 4 units of 10 Navy Breachers. They can use the detachment rules to maximal effects and also the deep striking things. A Deathwatch kill team led by a Watchmaster for some free stratagems. They'll be general purpose and punchy with Thunderhammers and frag cannons. A Voidsman armor squad along with a Rogue Trader entourage, being able to pin back the enemy in the mid-board if they want to, and then a Sisters of Battle squad split with Immolators for some multiple small unit sticky objectives and a little bit of melter threat. I'm certainly not sure where all the leaders would attach, but between them there's a couple of Inquisitors, potentially making stratagems a tiny bit cheaper. Inquisitor Draxus, who's all very nice for keeping a squad hidden and not able to be shot down at range, and then a Colexus for close range deep striking, and an Eversaw Assassin that you could swap those out for other assassins with the rule. Finally, there's a few Rhinos as well that could transport some combination of the Navy Breachers, the Deathwatch and the Subductors potentially, whichever ones might not be infiltrating. In any case, very cool to see a win for an army that's arguably one of 40k's very hardest to play, beating a good variety of opponents, though with fairly small score differences with some of them. This one just have to very intelligently play the objective game and sacrifice each unit for points as the game goes on, which might not be the easiest thing to do when the opponent can kill stuff way better, and will be trying to score as they go as well. Finally, for the Imperial armies, there's the Divergent Chapter Space Marines. For the Dark Angels, they've generally been using Gladius Task Force or Stormlance, and this list was a Stormlance Task Force by Toby Bennett, using it to place 5th at that massive South Coast Super Major. 5 wins to 1 defeat, though the first 5 were undefeated. Again, could be the equivalent of taking down a grand tournament elsewhere. It is kind of wild that for a Stormlance Task Force that has loads of the benefits all locked to either mounted units or fly vehicles, this one takes none of those things. I guess the draw is just advance and charge and reactive moves with one unit, and that's enough to make it the detachment of choice apparently. I guess getting advance and charge all game long on all those scary Deathwing Knights with their scary damage profiles is really quite a big win. There's 3 squads of 5 here that take the Mace of Absolution and a great weapon. Then there's 3 units of jump intercessors, nice for bouncing about doing secondary objectives and things but can still pack a punch when they charge into. 2 units of scouts that take combat knives in this one, good for scrapping in the mid-board, but between scout and advance and charge they certainly could threaten some damage turn 1 if it made sense. There's a unit of intercessors with a power fist for some sticky objectives and anti-horde, some assault intercessors that I guess would go with Azrael. They'll be a general purpose scary unit and can give him some big rerolls on objectives, likely after he sits around farming command points for the first few turns. A unit of incursors that can give a +1 to hit for the gun tanks, and then the whole arm is backed up by a trio of Predator Destructors, likely wanting to hit something hard with their autocannons and las cannon spam, maybe marked by Oath of Moment. Deathwing Knights do seem to have been certainly putting the smack down here, though I definitely find it interesting that even a faction with some good biker choices can sometimes choose to not bother to take them in a detachment that just fully revolves around mounted choices. Feel like I've seen at least some in a bunch of other Stormlance lists. Next up we've got the Black Templars, perhaps one of the factions that didn't have the best sentiments after the balance update. They've not really been doing all that well on the tournament scene, with a bunch of their units feeling a bit on the pricey side, and didn't really get affected by too much besides some generic Space Marine nerfs. This list was one that placed in Form 1 at that South Coast Super Major tournament, this one run by Dom Finnis, finishing in 25th place overall, just given the sheer amount of people on similar high results. Righteous Crusaders is the Templar Vows one, giving the option for feel no pains or damage things in melee, plus some nice close combat tricks such as extra AP or locking things in combat. Feels like the list has got a fair bit of threat in a massive unit of 10 Primaris Sword Brethren, a small unit of 5, and then 2 squads of 10 Crusaders with Power Fists. Again, I'm going to be guessing by character attachment a little bit here. I'd guess that the Judas here has to go with one of those Primaris Sword Brethren squads, and then most likely the combination of Helbrecht and the Castellan with the other. Not 100% sure which way round it is, but I feel like Helbrecht plus Castellan plus even 5 Sword Brethren is enough for a dangerous threat with a little bit of stratagem support to body most things in the game. But I guess given that the Castellan's got 10 houses bones, he probably wants to be in a big squad for that 5+ feel no pain. So maybe they both just join the really big one, go in the Land Raider Redeemer, and get all ready to just absolutely body something no matter how tough it is. It looks like the smaller unit rides in the Templar Impulsor with a multi-melter and missile array. Then for support things, there's a Combi Lieutenant to do secondary objectives and skirmish type things, 2 units of Infiltrators to deny deep strikes, a unit of Scouts to hold the midboard, a small unit of Inceptors with Plasma to do some secondary objectives for some good guarantees, and then finally to help on that front there's a Calatus Assassin as well. Looks like a pretty fun list, managing to make good use of a bunch of Templar options. Nice to see a Land Raider on the table for them. Next up for the Space Wolves, like the Dark Angels, they also make use of a Stormlance here. This list is by Dan Bruce, placing second at the All Is Dust GT, going 5 wins to 1 loss. With Stormlance and the mounted keyword, this one helps out their Thunderwolves quite a lot. Really big thing is to have them move extra fast, hit hard, and also be really durable in return as well. They've got that -1 to hit and wound against shooting, which can make them incredibly hard to take down. The Thunderwolves get joined by the usual combo of Wolfguard Battle Leader and Wolflord, adding lethal hits, free stratagems, reactive moves, and more. One of them takes Hunter's Instincts for the first turn strategic reserve arrival. Otherwise, nice to see some Blade Guy veterans here that got a lot cheaper in the last update. They're just 80 points now for 3 of them, and there's a big unit of 6 here with Ragnar Blackmane, Jumpy Atter and Impulsor. Ragnar can allow them to advance and charge, and just doubles down with even more high AP damage to attacks. There's Logan Grimnar and Terminator armor on foot. He can provide some big rerolls, and maybe could be a scary lone threat. There's 2 jump intercessors and a combi lieutenant that could help with scoring things, as could a unit of scouts, and then for a serious bit of tanky fire support there's a pair of vindicators, again still making the cut in army list despite the small points rise to 185. A pretty fun and well balanced list, that one. I guess it's interesting enough to see something besides just 18 Thunderwolves here, cutting back on a bit of the spam to take a few more varied units, having a bit of fire support, another big damage combo in those Blade Guards, and then lots of scoring things. Next up we've got the Deathwatch. They seem to have been having a fairly good time prior to the balance update, and only got some small tweaks with their Terminators going up slightly. In general not looking too bad. They almost always tend to use their Black Spear Task Force for competitive lists, giving them several turns worth of damage buffs but applying to their unique units only now. several punchy special issue ammo stratagems that makes their shooting far nastier, teleporting on and off the table, and flexing things with their mission tactics. This list by Alex Pinner was used to take second at Rosehammer 3, going 5 wins to 1 loss, the first 5 games undefeated. It looks like going extra 10 points on Terminators doesn't seem to have put them off for this list at least. There's 3 units of 5 of them here, all with triple cyclone missile launchers, and then a hammer and shield on the sergeant only. They're really quite scary units for damage and defense, could be good for some of the detachment rules like return to reserves or the special issue ammo stratagems, as they can apply to the cyclone missiles. Then there's 2 Indomitor kill teams with maximum eradicators, aggressors with flamestorm gauntlets, and the scary special issue ammo that they get with their bolt weapons. They get the +2 strength thing as well, and one of those has a Gravis captain in with a power fist and the tome of Ectoclades. That basically doubles up the Oath of Moment for a turn. Again, really big powerful units that are very efficient for stratagems, and particularly free ones with the captain. Then there's a Watchmaster with a big unit of veterans, allowing them to advance, shoot and charge, and potentially more free stratagems once again. Looks like they're getting where they need to be in a Rhino. And then there's a bit of scoring support with a Combi Lieutenant, Incursors that can mark a target for a +1 to hit, could be nice for the Terminators or the Indomitor team. Some Infiltrators maybe to guard the home field objective with their Deep Strike denial, and then a Storm Speeder Thunderstrike. That feels like that could be quite a nice choice alongside Indomitor kill teams and the Terminators, given they've got loads of mid-strength firepower. Overall looks like kind of business as usual for the Deathwatch. Lots of big scary efficient kill teams with massive damage, but could be important pieces if they are exposed and you lose lots of them at once. Finally for the Imperium, we've got the Blood Angels using their Liberator Assault group, the big punchy detachment for +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge, plus some pretty great support such as Advance and Charge and Red Rampage for yet more damage. This one was used by Tom Dean, placing 5th at Planet Arcanite with 4 wins for 1 loss. And interestingly, this one seems to be basically a sort of Red Space Marine style list, despite Blood Angels no longer getting the boosted Oath of Moment with a +1 to wound. Still looks like there were 0 actual Blood Angels units used in this one. I guess potentially it might have been another chapter taking up Blood Angels rules for this one maybe. In any case, maybe the interesting thing that is here are a whole bunch of the much cheaper Blade Guard veterans, 2 units of 6 of them, each for 160 points. I'd guess one of them with the captain, given that he is taking the loadout that can join them, and he takes Rage Fueled Warrior for the big sustained hits that he can trigger on the same turn as his extra attacks and turn him into an absolute blender. And then one squad with a chaplain for the +1 to wound. Certainly on the charge they're going to make a nasty mess of things. Then there's 3 units of jump intercessors, always popular for the Blood Angels for skirmishing and loads of damage in their own right. 2 sets of 5 assault intercessors, a squad of intercessors for their sticky objectives and anti-horde, some infiltrators for their deep strike denial, some scouts for scrapping in the mid-board and scoring objectives. And then looks like some of the melee things might be hitching a ride in that repulsor. I guess in theory if you wanted to, you could put both units of Blade Guard in there alongside their attached characters in each squad, though that might feel a bit all eggs in one basket maybe. Finally, there's a Calidus Assassin to jump on and off the board and score some objectives, and some trusty Space Marine firepower, 3 Ballistus Dreadnoughts and a Storm Speeder Hammer Strike to ignore some cover. Again, the points increases on the Ballistus Dreadnoughts don't seem to have been enough for putting people off them, and Blood Angels enjoying a bit of fire support to help out their assault stuff. Overall, certainly not really a typical Blood Angels list these days. Definitely just one example of what you could use. Average Blood Angels lists tend to be much more heavy on their unique units, usually with good use of Sanguinary Guard, their fighty lone operatives, and often some Death Company with Lamarties or similar. This one certainly feels a bit more like what you'd see if they had the boosted Oath of Moments that they were trying to game for. Moving on though, let's get into the Armies of Chaos, and first up we have the Chaos Space Marines with some Renegade Raiders, this one listed under an Anthanora, first at Banished Cup in France, with 5 wins to no losses. Renegade Raiders is the one that gives you the assault keyword and extra AP against things on objectives, plus some nice movement ones like Advance and Charge and a few transport shenanigans. This one's headed up by no less than Abaddon the Despoiler himself, a big melee threat, plus allowing you to do some big rerolls for units nearby. I guess that'd be particularly helpful for the Predator Destructors and the Forge Fiends. I'd guess that he probably would be leading a unit, which would be... I'm not sure if he's just running solo in this list, given that Fabius Bile would be an interesting choice with all those chosen jumping into the Rhino, unless Fabius is doing something a little bit more alternative and going with the Cultists or the Legionaries, which he perfectly could do. In any case, looks like a Rhino moves up with some sort of threat inside it. There's some Cultists for sticky objectives, and Legionaries for some rerolls scrapping for the midboard. Cyphers around as a fairly big hitting lone operative with all those plasma pistol shots and bolt shots, and then there's 2 fairly enormous units of Possessed, 2 squads of 10 of them. They'll certainly enjoy the advance and charge from this detachment, and on their big go turn they get some devastating wounds, and they'll also like the extra AP against things on objectives, which is another weakness at AP -1 for them. Finally, as mentioned, there's a good bit of firepower, 3 Chaos Predator Destructors with las cannon sponsons. Their autocannons can get up to very good AP in this detachment, targeting infantry on objectives, and then 1 Forge Fiend with triple ectoplasma cannon. That one got a little bit cheaper in the last balance update. Just nice general purpose firepower with 3 copies of blast, meaning it can really go through any sort of massed up infantry squad, as well as tough tanks and vehicles with the big strength and damage. Looks like this one's still set to be one of the more popular Chaos detachments, maybe alongside Creations of Bile, which has perhaps had a little bit more success recently. Next up, for the Sons of Mortarion, the Death Guard have their Plague Company. This is an army list by Matthew Murrell, placing in 9th with this one at the Rocky Mountain Open. 5 wins to 1 loss, though the first 5 were undefeated, again potentially putting the performance in Grand Tournament winning status if that run had been done elsewhere. Death Guard were doing pretty well before the balance update. They did have a few things shifted about, Predator Destructors going up a little bit and Blight Haulers going down. It looks like that might well have played into the choices made in this list potentially. This one goes really heavy on the light demon engines. 3 individual Mephitic Blight Haulers for a little bit of anti-elite and anti-tank, and then interestingly enough 3 bloat drones, one each with 3 of their different weapons, the Flesh Mower, Blight Launcher and Plague Spitters. There's also a Hellbrute as well to go alongside those, able to mark targets for contagion at longer range, which could potentially help boost the firepower ones a little bit. Then there's really quite a big cast of characters in the list. Mortarion, as often is the case, is the featured heart of the army, really tough and able to provide some buffs to things nearby. There's Typhus, likely joining a squad of Deathshroud Terminators, a big melee threat with their immense stat lines for the points cost, even if they are rather slow. A Lord of Contagion, I'd guess joining the other one. A nice damage boost for him, and he takes the Deadly Pathogen enhancement as well, to make him just a little bit more mighty. Then there's 3 squads of 5 Plague Marines looking like they're loading into 2 Rhinos. They all take heavy plague weapons, one takes extra bubotic weapons, and a couple of squads with extra special weapons. I guess potentially the ones with the bubotic weapons might go with the Biologist Putrefier and maybe the Foul Blight Spawn as well, giving you an extra dangerous melee squad, and then the Malignant Plague Caster goes with one of the others for a little bit of Pestilent Fire support. They're always very scary when jumping out of Rhinos and hitting things hard in the midboard. Finally, there's just 1 unit of Poxwalkers, nice cheap chaff that can hold down objectives, and is at least fairly tough for the cost. Overall, a whole load of well-known Death Guard good stuff there. I'm sure taking good advantage of the -1 toughness and extra AP that their detachment rules can bring. I guess it won't be too long before they have some major changes come their way with their codex. 4,000 Suns, as a relatively lesser played faction, they were one of the ones that I struggled to find a top placing list for. So for this one I thought I'd just take a look at the highest placing list at one of the big tournaments, this one by Sam McClinchy going 3-2 at the South Coast Super Major. 1,000 Suns had a few small balance changes that didn't really change massive amounts, making Scarab Occult and their sorcerers a bit cheaper, but then also putting up the Mutalith Vortex Beast. This list maybe feels a little bit different to the 1,000 Suns cookie cutter style list, going heavy on the bodies. Magnus the Red takes the centrepiece of the army as normal, a big fast moving threat that can use the Kabbalistic rituals and stratagems rather well, plus amp up all the psychic damage nearby, and there's going to be a lot of that here with an Exalted Sorcerer and then 3 Infernal Masters no less, joining the Rubric Marines that can give them the rerolls, and then there's the Detachment Rule and potentially Magnus to make them scarier with that. One of them takes the damage buff in the Arcane Vortex, and 1 Lord of Forbidden Law for the Kabbalistic Ritual manipulation. There's also an Exalted Sorcerer joining a different Rubric Marine squad with the Umbralific Crystal, and that can allow them to teleport them about later in the game. As mentioned though, this list really goes heavy on the amount of stuff on the table. 6 units of 5 Rubric Marines, which is more than average. They're taking Warp Flamers for some big rerolls against things on objectives, plus a Soul Reaper cannon each. They can be quite scary Overwatch as well if it's needed. Then beyond that, there's another 50 sort of chaff bodies, 2 units of 10 Zangors, and then 3 units of 10 Cultists. Nice enough with their Invulnerable Save and Scout in 1,000 Suns. There's also a Rhino presumably taking some of the Rubric Marines, maybe with Infernal Masters to fire out the top hatch. Interesting to see a slightly different take on the faction. I feel like the more standard build maybe has a couple of Mutalith Beasts, a bit less chaff, and probably slightly fewer Rubrics too. I'm still wondering if we might be getting to the point where Scarab Occult Terminators might become interesting after Games Workshop has slashed their points cost for about the 3rd time in a row. I wonder if they'll see much play before their codex comes out. Finally, for the Deity Legions that are currently active in tournaments, we've got the World Eaters. They tend to both make good use of their Berserker Warband and their Grotmus Vessels of Wrath one. It still looks like the majority of people were playing Berserker Warband after the balance update though, even though the Demon Princes getting cheaper seemed like it helped Vessels on paper. This list by Taylor Davis took first at the OP Luck of the Irish Grand Tournament though, going 5 wins to no losses at a 47 player event. This one using Berserker Warband, so as well as the Blessings of Khorne for the various speed and damage boosts that it can bring, you also get the simple damage boost on the charge and not having to choose a few units for that. Heading up the list as normal is Angron, a massive great big meteor of rage that can move forward, break things in a big way, force the opponent to deal with him, and then have a good chance to come back from the dead, particularly with the Blessings rules amped up by some Khornate icons like the ones on the Jackals, and maybe the favourite of Khorne one that's present on the Juggernaut Lord here. In addition to Angron, there's Lord Invocatus to scout forward some Exalted 8-bound, I'd guess, and then a Juggernaut Lord that got significantly cheaper, down to 80 points now. I guess he might just be running completely solo, though could be joining one of the others, I suppose. In any case, he has the favour to Khorne single game rerolls one. Then this one's at least fairly heavy on the 8-bound, 3 sets of 3 of them with dual chain fists on the Sergeant, with the damage buffs well capable of tangling with the vast majority of things on the game, a single unit of regular 8-bound with Lacerators, 2 sets of 10 Jackals, and 2 sets of 2 Spawn, some nice screening chaff, the Jackals getting some sticky objectives, and then finally for the crowning Khornate glory on the list, there's a Khorne Lord of Skulls, an enormous great big demon engine with some scary firepower between the Demon Gore Cannon and the Skull Hurler, a whole bunch of defense that most armies are going to struggle to deal with both him and Angron at the same time, and of course massive amounts of melee damage for anything that he can catch in close combat. Fun to see one of these on the table and doing well, and lots of nice Khornate violence overall here. Beyond the Chaos Space Marines for the Forces of Chaos, we've also got some Chaos Knights as well. This list seemingly been their best performance since the Balance Pass, and this one was from the week before. A traitorous lance full of knights that was absolutely full of war dogs, played by Johnny Simmons, using it to take second at the 6++ Grand Tournament, going 5 wins undefeated. War Dog spam has been pretty much the cookie cutter way to play Chaos Knights for some time now, and Games Workshop hasn't really ever done anything enormously significant to counter it, even if a few of the big knights dropped by some incremental points cost last time around. In this one, there's the tried and tested 6 Brigands and Carnivores, the Brigands with their very general purpose damage output hitting on 2s, with a chain cannon for infantry and melters for tanks, the Carnivores being a great combination of pretty fast, pretty tough, pretty good on objectives, and having some of the best out-and-out damage outputs for 40k units in general. And then all of them get Havoc launchers on the top as well, which could be handy for certain armies that aren't expecting lots of indirect fire in the meta at the moment, perhaps armies like Aeldari Aspect Warriors being one of the most obvious. Then to lead the army, there's a War Dog Stalker, this one with Slaughter Claw and Demon Breath Spear, and he takes Aura of Terror for some sticky objectives. And the army can use the detachment buffs, such as potentially battle-shocked units being a fair bit easier to kill, the walk-through wall stratagem, and the sustained hits for multiple focus War Dog fire one. Still looks like Chaos Knights are broadly on Team War Dog spam right now. Feels like it's probably going to stay that way until their Codex comes out, which hopefully shouldn't be too far away. Finally for Chaos, we've got the Demons, with the massive nerfs to Legion of Excess. As expected, people have been shifting back to Demon Incursion and the Shadow Legion. It looks like both of those have been played in fairly similar numbers, and I must admit I didn't think it was immediately obvious which one would do better or worse initially. For an example of a high placing list for them though, there was this one by Justin Serrano, using it to take 7th at Rocky Mountain Open, going 5 wins to 1 loss and the first 5 games undefeated on the trot. Demon Incursions definitely is still a really powerful detachment. It's the one that allows you some very close range charges, dropping things in at 6 inches either with a stratagem or near the greater demons, some powerful enhancements for the greater demons, plus a few nice stratagems like close deep strikes, returning to reserve and advance and charge among others. As often seems to be the case with the more undivided demon approach, this one goes very heavy on the greater demons. There's Be'lakor here with his new higher points cost but also buffed stats. He's a fair bit more dangerous than he used to be, and he can shield the rest of the things from shooting early in the game with his shadows. There's then both Rotigus and a Great Unclean One. The Aura of the Great Unclean One can now make Nurgle things +1 toughness, so effectively they can be toughness 13, and the regular Great Unclean One takes Endless Gift as well. That model might have gone up a lot in points cost, but it's also got even more tanky, and the Biosword is a fair bit more threatening than it used to be. Otherwise there's a Lord of Change with the Everstave, for a fairly shooty big monster, and also Scarbrands now able to advance and charge innately with a whole bunch of Khornate violence. Then for support for them, there's a unit of Plague Bearers, nice and tanky and getting their sticky objectives. a single Beast of Nurgle that gains Scout, 2 units of Fleshhounds that gains the Return to Reserve special rule so they can be on and off the board doing secondaries, a unit of Screamers that got a little bit cheaper and are still fairly threatening, and then 1 unit of 5 Seekers that can scout up the board and basically get in the way and move block the enemy early on if it makes sense. Overall still seems that Demons are very much a force to be reckoned with, but generally going with the undivided approach as opposed to the deity detachments now. There was also this example from last week as well. This one was a Shadow Legion one by Cody Drake. Kind of wild to see 3 great unclean ones there, with the big Nurgle durability buffs in this detachment, and then Be'lakor, a Bloodthirster, and an allied Knight Despoiler. Lots of crazy scary big demons and chaos things in this one. Finally though, let's talk about some victorious lists of Xenos, and first up we've got a Tyranids Invasion Fleet one, this one by KU Orellana, using it to place first at Nurgle Mania with 5 wins undefeated. Tyranids had a few wins and losses from the data slate, Exocrines and Tyrannofexes going up a little bit, but Hive Tyrants and Neurolictors going down, the same with Trigons. It does seem that most of those on both sides of the equation are present in this list. Tyranids often seem to be gravitating towards Invasion Fleet or Vanguard Onslaught, and this one's an Invasion Fleet one. Nice big damage buffs against one section of the enemy army, a good feel no pain type stratagem that's quite handy to trigger up with a Hive Tyrant, and then some fairly nice support for Endless Multitudes, allowing you to regenerate a good number of them. I guess they'll be going heavy on this one given that they've got lots of those. No less than 3 units of 20 Hormagaunts, so maybe a little bit more likely to take casualties but not be outright wiped out, and then 1 squad of Gargoyles and 1 squad of Termagants with Spine Fists. Feels like those Hormagaunts would just be able to repeatedly swarm one mid-board objective if you just wanted to auto-see the opponent, and at least do a bit of damage to lighter infantry, maybe even some slightly tougher stuff with lethal hits I guess. Otherwise for mainline damage dealers there's still 2 Exocrines and 2 Tyrannofexes with Rupture Cannons. Still massively efficient firepower. The Exocrines maybe a bit more anti-elite, though they can get lethal hits in 2 ways from this detachment, and the Tyrannofexes being the best anti-tank. There's a Hive Tyrant that might body up with them a bit. He'd be good to give them feel no pain style stratagems, though he's equipped for a more melee loadout personally and takes adaptive biology to make him tougher. There's a big unit of scary Genestealers that could move up to the mid-board and be a big threat. Interesting to see so many of them here but without a Broodlord to lead them. And then for other supporting stuff, besides the lots of Swarm bodies, there's a Biovore with Spore Mines to do board control and maybe the odd secondary objective. A Neurolictor, now down at 80 points, and a cheap lone operative that can potentially occasionally make certain units a lot easier to kill or deny enemies trying to contest objectives. A unit of Raveners that can borrow on and off the board doing secondaries and have a bit of melee threat as well, and some Tyranid warriors with melee bio weapons, a fairly punchy countercharge unit perhaps, and provide some synapse. Finally there's a Neuro Tyrant, a little bit of sort of Psychic Flame Overwatch, maybe could be handy to give synapse to the Hormagaunts before they go bounding into combat, and amps up the Shadow in the Warp so more things fail. Overall feels like a pretty nicely balanced Tyranids list here. Lots of interesting tricks and units to get advantages over the enemy in one way or another, and really quite a good balance between leader beasts, swarms and big damage bugs. Next up we've got the Aeldari, who seem to be doing rather well right now. I think a lot of people were expecting them to be one of the single strongest armies after the balance update, and early impressions they still seem to be living up to that. In particular, the Devoted of Iniad seems to have been winning tournaments, getting loads of high placings and has around about a 60% win rate. The Inari having some really powerful tricks with things like their moves out of sequence, occasional pop-up fight first, and a few nice damage things that their detachment can do. They certainly took a fair few less nerfs compared with the Aspect host. In any case, leading this one we've got Ivrain and the Vizarg, a really powerful melee pairing when they're in a big unit of Inari Incubi. Ivrain can make them wound things a lot better. The Vizarg gives them fights first, and that should be a big scary unit that almost anything is going to be scared to tangle with. Then there's 3 units of Fire Dragons, with the Exarchs with their boosted fusion guns. They're maybe some of the best users of the moves out of sequence, or maybe some of the battle-focused tricks potentially, getting absolutely terrifying anti-tank damage into the enemy. Still seems they're all very viable at 110 points. There's 2 squads of Dark Reapers, interestingly taking the missile launchers rather than Tempest launchers here, and being played in squads of 5 given that the 10 squads have a higher tax now. 2 units of 5 Warp Spiders, these equipped with Spinneret rifles and Death Weavers for the very shooty variant. They can mess up lighter infantry squads and teleport 24 inches to do some secondaries. There's 2 squads of Striking Scorpions, infiltrating into the mid-board and messing up the enemy with some fairly good anti-infantry damage. Again, no pivoting away from this one, despite a points increase there. 1 squad of Howling Banshees with fast-moving anti-infantry. 1 squad of Corsair Void Weavers, which I thought were interesting. Not 100% sure what their purpose is, maybe guarding a home field objective or similar. 2 individual Warlock Skyrunners for some very cheap nuisance units perhaps. I guess they could bait the opponent into killing them and maybe give some advantages for the Aeldari there. And then finally 3 big stompy Wraith Lords, taking Bright Lances, Flamers and the Ghostglaives, potentially good users of Aeldari movement shenanigans maybe, and just generally strong units for their stats with their built-in rerolls against certain things. Finally there's 1 Wave Serpent, not 100% sure what's riding in that one. I believe the Incubi aren't allowed in it anymore, so I guess it might be something like the Fire Dragons or the Dark Reapers, getting where they need to be in style. Overall certainly a whole bunch of scary Space Elves on foot there, lots of pretty brutal damage output and movement shenanigans when all put together. It's still looking like Aeldari are one of the armies to fear in 10th at the moment. For the Drukhari, they've been looking a little bit more mid to lower 40k recently, a lesser played faction right now, and the vast majority of their army lists are either using Reaper's Wager or Sky Splinter Assault, though interestingly enough it was a Real Space Raiders one that seems to have taken a good spot here. This army list by Grant Stevens Bulmer, going 4 wins to 1 loss at the South Coast Super Major. Real Space Raiders gives out a few extra pain tokens, and beyond that it's quite a helpful one for supporting Talos. -1 to wound is quite nice for them, as could Strike and Fade be potentially, getting them a whole load more movement. This one is going for a bit of an Alliance of Agony with an Archon, Lilith Hesperax and then Urian Rekarth. Looks like the Archon would most likely lead their Incubi, jumping out of a Venom to hit things very hard in close combat. Lilith Hesperax with a squad of 10 witches, I guess appearing that they might be going on foot in this one. And then Urian Rekarth going solo, maybe supporting those Talos with some nice healing. He's not that easy to kill on his own anyway. Otherwise there's a unit of Cabalite Warriors that looks like it to be split amongst Venoms, 2 squads of Mandrakes to infiltrate for the mid-board and use Fade Away for secondaries if they need to, 2 squads of Scourges with Dark Lances with their move shoot move to inflict Dark Lance pain at long range, 3 Ravagers with Dark Lances, so you could have a pretty blistering amount of anti-tank firepower right from turn 1 if you needed to, 1 Kronos Parasite Engine to keep the pain flowing, and then 3 sets of 2 Talos. Just really quite efficient damage and defensive units, each with a Talos Gauntlet, Liquefy Guns and Haywire Blasters, and a nice general purpose threat that's going to at least worry most things in the game. Interesting to see the Drukhari do quite so well with maybe one of their less used attachments right now. Next up we've got the Necrons, who have mainly been playing with their Starshatter Arsenal, Awakened Dynasty and Hypercrypt Legion recently. They're only changing the balance pass being slightly more expensive Doomsday Arcs, though they remain a good unit at 200 points and still make an appearance here. For one example of a well-performing list, there's this Awakened Dynasty one by Andreas Hoffman, coming in 12th at the Rocky Mountain Open, going the first 4 games undefeated. The Awakened Dynasty is the all very character and leader focused one, where the units get a +1 to hit for a character inside them, and then have some really quite powerful stratagems as well, things like reactive reanimations, and extra shooting damage, and a few others. In this one it looks like one of the main combos is Orokin the Diviner with the Royal Warden with the Netherrealm Casket for some teleporting, and they can all go inside a squad of Necron Warriors, making that unit just exceptionally tanky with a 4+ invulnerable save, and perhaps a good target for that reanimation stratagem, maybe along with a Ghost Arc and the Reanimator both near it. That means that you could have a whole load of very tanky Necron Warriors just rising from death. Kind of fun to see a core warrior combo like that, and you'd also be able to fall back and shoot with that Royal Warden as well, so they're not going to get stuck in combat and unable to deal damage. Then for another couple of leader combos, there's Scorpet Lords alongside 2 sets of 3 Scorpet Destroyers, at least relatively cheap and very threatening units there. Lots of big hitting attacks that can deal with enemy elites. There's a Catacomb Command Barge that can amp up units with some extra objective control, and that one takes the Enagic Dermal Bond, so the one for the big feel no pain, so it's actually quite tanky in this one. There's a lone operative Hexmark Destroyer, and for the last of the characters there's the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer. Pretty hard to go too far wrong with Necrons for the enormous stack of stats that it has, just moving towards a mid-board objective and making itself a problem. Otherwise, for some objective support, there's a unit of Flayed Ones to infiltrate into the mid-board, some Ophidian Destroyers which can burrow on and off the board, maybe helping with secondary objectives and still have some melee threat. There's a pair of Crypto Thralls, which I should have mentioned earlier really. I guess they'd go with the Warrior combo with Orokin. The Hexmark Destroyer as a lone operative. I kind of wonder if he starts in the Ghost Arc here, as otherwise it wouldn't have anything to go inside it, and it needs something as a transport. And then finally a couple of Doomsday Arcs, still having the big scary heavy firepower that the Necrons want, as seemingly the unit of choice here even outside of Starshatter. Definitely looks like some fun stuff here. The Scorpet Lords and the Destroyers would be cool to use, and that big central warrior combo looks fun. Enormous amounts of 4+ invulnerable save ones, and the ability for a disturbing number of them to stand up on death with their reanimation tricks. I guess the Catacomb Command Barge could also help out with them as well, come to think of it, with its Resurrection Orb. Next up, we've got the Tau Empire, maybe an army that was having a few more problems than some factions last time around before the balance update, slightly lower win rates than most, though quite good internal balance between their factions with a lot of them interesting. For one of their high placings, this one was done with the Auxiliary Cadre, played by John Kilcommons, and used it to take 14th at the Rocky Mountain Open here, going 5 wins to 1 loss. The Auxiliary Cadre is the sort of allied Crute and Vespid one, where the Crute and Vespid units can get protection from being shot at long range if they hang out near Tau, but can also help out with Tau firepower if they go near the enemy. Plus there's some interesting enough stuff to boost the damage output of Crutox Rampages, and an extra strength stratagem for Tau shooting, amongst some other fun things. Leading the army is Shadowsun with her big rerolls, being a lone operative, and potentially some command point regeneration. There's also an Enforcer commander as well with some missile pods and admired leader. He'd certainly quite enjoy the extra AP that you can get from the detachment, and I guess him with a bunch of missile pod fire knife suits could also potentially enjoy the strength one against the right target. And my leader is one that allows you to give you extra objective control and leadership to nearby Crute or Vespid before they go charging off. Otherwise, for Tau firepower, this one's going very heavy on the ion weapons. There's 2 hammerhead gunships with ion cannons and burst cannons, and then 2 razor shark fighters with a whole bunch of ion turrets. Interesting to see some aircrafts in play, and probably not the best news for them if Games Workshop gets wind of that. Again, I suppose they're units that would really quite enjoy the extra AP, and maybe could use the +2 strength stratagem if it made sense. There's also yet more ion stuff with some Path Riders with a bunch of ion rifles. There's a pair of broadsides with some rail rifles and seeker missiles, and then 3 sets of 3 stealth suits to mark for them, guided fire, rerolling ones to hit and wound and ignoring cover. Then for the auxiliary part of the Auxiliary Cadre, there's 3 units of 5 Vespid, can potentially be moving really quite quick up to get the detachment buffs off, or jump on or off the board to do secondary objectives. 2 sets of 10 Crute Carnivores with their sticky objectives, and then 3 sets of the 3 Crutox Rampagers, which are now really cheap at just 85 points. They do seem kind of hard to go too far wrong with between their defense and their damage. I guess not being able to shoot them even out in the open at longer range doesn't hurt them too much in this detachment. They can make quite good use of plenty of the stratagems too. In any case, nice to see a strong result for the alien allied version of the Tau Empire. Next up, we've got some Space Dwarfs with the Leagues of Votann. They've been doing fairly solidly average with around about 50% win rates prior to the update, and it didn't seem too likely that all that much would change after it. They did shift the army rule round a bit, so that the half band would get some double judgment marked units, but that still doesn't look like it's convinced basically anyone to try it. As expected then, the Votann's top performances generally came with the Oath Band. This list by a Ronnie Kinney was used to take 3rd at Team Keelhaul GT, going 4 wins to 1 loss, only being defeated in the last game. Like most Leagues of Votann armies recently, it goes at least fairly heavy on the Sagittars and the Land Fortresses. Very typical 2 Land Fortresses, going for the cyclic ion cannons though, as opposed to the Beamers. Big sturdy vehicles that can use stratagems well, such as the shoots back after you've been damaged, and quite nice with void armour. It looks like one of them might be transporting some Einhir Hearthguard into battle, along with an Einhir champion. They could be quite nice with the rerolls for the Vulcanite shooting out of the Land Fortress with the shooting rule as well. There's then 3 Sagittars with high-las beam cannons. It looks like they'll be transporting some sort of combo of the Hearthkin Warriors and Chthonian Berserks. I wouldn't be too surprised if maybe they're trying to split the Hearthkin Warriors in this one, and maybe put some of the Berserks in the other Land Fortress. It just feels like most of the time the Hearthkin Warriors just do so much better if they're split in half and become small, more expendable units than a big massed up 10 squad of them. They have some high-las weapons, but are mainly good for their sticky objectives. Then there's some Graviton fire support from some Brockhere Thunderkin, who are going with a Brockhere Iron Master here. Fairly nasty close range fire support. Kind of interested as to how they're being delivered. Maybe they could go in strategic reserve or just foot slogging it up across the board. And then finally, for a little bit of scouting and screening, there's 1 unit of Hernkin Jaegers to infiltrate for the midboard with some shotguns, and then 2 sets of Hernkin Pioneers with rotary cannons for a bit of general purpose scouting with some massed up firepower. Overall, maybe not crazily changing the formula on more standard Votann tournament lists. I think the most interesting thing is probably the Brockhere Iron Master with the Thunderkin. Feels like they're a bit more of a maybe include for a bunch of people, even if they are a lot more efficient since their points went down. Next though, we get to perhaps the big bad of Warhammer 40k at the moment, with the Orks Mordaka detachment. This one definitely created a bit of a stir for the sort of concerning side at the balance update. The Orcs' new detachment giving all their infantry and walkers sustained hits too was kind of wild, plus doubling down with a bit of fire support from a good enhancement or two, and a few stratagems for either extra AP or ignoring cover in one way or another, but mainly just the detachment rule on sustained hits too just absolutely pushes the damage output of looters and tank busters massively through the roof. to the point where they're basically some of the game's most efficient shooting and can have a good chance of killing more of their points cost of a whole range of different units if they're given the opportunity to fire once. On top of that, as if that weren't enough, they've also got a 1 command point stratagem to put 1 unit in the war each turn. And that's an absolute god tier stratagem given just how many layered buffs that can give you. Essentially 5 different buffs at once, and then even on top of that you might get a datasheet boost, like say extra movement for Zodgrod Wartsnagger or fightier war bosses and things. In any case, as a result it looks like the Mordaka Orks placed in 1st, 2nd and 3rd, not only at the South Coast Super Major here, but also at the other enormous tournament of over 200 players. It does feel like it's sending a message a bit when they take literally all the podium spots against all comers against the 2 biggest events of the weekend. In any case, this is the one winning the South Coast Super Major by Ben Jones. 7 wins undefeated and taking a whole bunch of the scary units. 3 sets of 10 looters seems borderline auto-include, as does the 3 sets of tank busters. The looters take custom Mega Blaster mechs in this one, and the tank busters take the Smash Hammer and Pulsar rockets. They've got a good amount of trucks to get them to the fight. Perhaps some of the tank busters bodying up with some flash kits. To lead the units, there's also 3 shock attack gun mechs as well, one with targeting squigs, which could be quite nice for the looters, and one with devastating wounds. There's Zodgrod Wartsnagger, who can lead 22 Gretchen, and if you use the War stratagem on him turn 1, then he can potentially scout 9 inches. The squad move forward an extra 12 and potentially advance and charge at the same turn. The biggest problem though is that it could just body block the entirety of the enemy army absolutely right away. And then there's some more things for some counter charge and scary melee. There's a beast boss with 10 beast snagger boys. They're enormously dangerous at taking down tough stuff given the devastating wounds of the beast boss on the charge. And then a big unit of 20 boys led by a pain boy, just to give you a bunch of durable OC on a mid-board objective. Finally, there's just one last unit of Gretchen, presumably to rustle up some command points on the home field. Overall, certainly looks like it's living up to its reputation, with it being expected to be the single strongest army in the game, and probably going to attract Games Workshop nerfs in the near future. Here's just one of the other 6 iterations that took the top spots. This one by Manny Chima, 2nd at the South Coast Super Major. Lots of similarities to this one, but for differences, there were 2 units of 20 boys rather than just 1, another unit of 10 flash kits in place of beast snagger boys, but otherwise the vast majority are the same choices. Just seems kind of hard to think why you'd leave the looters and tank busters at home if you had access to them. The shock attack gun mechs go for a slightly different choice of enhancements, one taking the dead shiny shooters for some rapid fire goodness, maybe going with the tank busters there. Finally, for the look through the armies though, the final army is the Genestealer Cult Final Day. This one does seem to have been putting in some good tournament results for them since the Grotmus release. It's the Allied with Tyranids detachment, where as well as Genestealer Cult units you can take some Vanguard invaders from the Nids. While the Vanguard units are nearby enemy units, Genestealers get a +1 to hit. There's a nice reroll the wound rolls in a fight phase style buff, a good return to reserves one, and the Genestealer Cults gets to recycle just as many units as they would do otherwise. Going through the army, there's a unit of 10 Pure Strains led by a Patriarch, a very nasty damage dealing threat in the mid-board, and they could coordinate with the various lictors and lone operatives out there, certainly making the enemy units maybe a bit more nervous advancing on their position. And then there's 2 other big damage punches as well, a unit of 10 Acolytes with heavy mining tools, and then a unit of Metamorphs with hand flamers. They both seem quite nasty for skirmishing in the mid-board. Looks like some combination of that would hitch a ride in a Goliath truck, and there's also a Biophagus to lead them as well for some lethal hit goodness. I feel like that's been more effective on the Metamorphs, at least on paper, though I might be misunderstanding. And his enhancement would stop the unit from getting overwatched as they charge in. Otherwise, there's 2 smaller units of Acolyte hybrids with hand flamers. One could farm some command points potentially, though they can be at least fairly threatening throwing some demo charges around. Riding in the Goliath Rock Grinders could be another option for them as well. There's 2 of those with mining lasers, and 2 sets of 2 Achilles Ridge Runners with mining lasers and spotters for hitting on a 3+, and then 1 Ridge Runner with a Mortar and Survey Auger, maybe being better for marking a target for other units to attack with boosted AP and ignore cover. Then to support them, there's a whole bunch of Tyranid lone operatives, Death Leaper, 2 Lictors with their free rapid ingress, and then the Neurolictor with the Battle Shock debuffs, and then 3 sets of 10 Gargoyles with their fast moving IOC, and being able to get into unusual areas of the board with their deep strike and then move shoot move if they want to. Overall definitely feels like there's a lot going on with this one. Loads of scoring stuff that's going to be hard to catch up with all those lone operatives and smaller units. Perhaps a surprising amount of anti-tank firepower with all those mining lasers, and then some big melee damage punches with the Metamorphs, Acolytes and Pure Strains. Really quite a fun looking army list all around there. That just about brings us to the end of a quick look at one army list per Warhammer 40k faction though. Let me know your thoughts on any of them down in the comments below. Any other insights or interesting stuff about how they were played is always appreciated. As mentioned, a big thank you to Starforged for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description below if you'd like to take a look at a bunch of fancy faction themed 40k goodies of one sort or another. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page as well, and some affiliate discount links in the video description if you're picking up some models anytime in the near future. A big thank you to anyone supporting via those, but otherwise a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.